There are many studies that state how crime has a great economic impact in many countries. But how can this be explained? How does crime affect Latin America's GDP? In order to explain this, we're going to focus on homicide crimes, which are acts in which someone causes death by his or her actions. In 2012, the United Nations estimated that the number of homicides in the world amounted to a total of 437,000. 36% of the share was registered in America, 5% in Europe, in Asia 28%, Oceania 0.3%, and Africa 31%. As you can see, America has the highest share of homicide. But we're going to focus on Latin America. There are many countries in Latin America where homicide rate is very high. For example, in Mexico, the intentional homicide rate per year per 100,000 inhabitants is 21.5. In El Salvador is 41.2. In Honduras is 90.4, in Colombia is 30.8, in Venezuela 53.7, and finally in Brazil 25.2. But how is this related to the economy? A study determined that crime and violence costs nations an average of 3% of GDP every year. So what are the costs of crime? We can divide this in 4 categories. The first one being the money spent by government in the face of violence, and that is invested in security, judicial power, public prosecutors and defenders' office, and the penitentiary administration. Secondly, the money spent by potential victims. This includes households and businesses that invest in security to protect themselves from victimization and organized crime by investing in alarms, insurance, or hiring security companies. Thirdly, the cost of lost opportunity represented by prisoners who no longer contribute to society and especially to the economic maintenance of their families. According to the World Bank, GDP per capita could increase between $51 and $70 if there was a reduction of 10% in the number of homicides. This would mean a 1% GDP per capita increase in those countries where crime rate is high. And finally, we take a look in the consequences that fear has on the economy. There is a decrease in the foreign direct investment. This affects a country's economy in many ways. The first effect that violence has on an economy is the way it limits international capital flows. An explanation to this is how people perceive the country's economy unstable. In addition, fear can also affect negatively entrepreneurship, since the high rates of crime also hurt people's confidence in the possibility for entrepreneurship. And lastly, there is a reduction in tourism. The number of visitors decreases because of the crime rate, as they no longer see it as an attractive destination due to a lack of safety and security. Now, how can all this directly affect GDP? To see that, we're going to take a look at the GDP function. The first variable in the function is consumption. This would decrease because if there's no tourism, for example, then visitors do not consume in the country. Also, remember those prisoners that represented the lost opportunity cost? Those people that are in jail are no longer a source of income at a household, which affects the household's economy, leading to a reduction in consumption as well. As we mentioned earlier, foreign investment decreases, which also reduces the investment variable in the GDP function. However, we could see an increase in government spending in terms of security, judicial power, and the other services that are said to face crime in the country. The impact that crime has on the economy can also be represented through the productivity function. This function is explained through the variables represented by technology, capital, and labor. This last one is greatly affected, as when there is a high number of imprisoned inhabitants, that number is equivalent to the number of labor that is no longer producing in the economy. Innovation is low, as government gives little incentive to the population to become entrepreneurs. Furthermore, as government expenditure is mainly focused on defense and security, it leaves education aside. This leads to an unskilled labor force, which also decreases productivity. Now, we're going to take a deeper analysis into some Latin America's countries. So let's begin with Mexico. Violent crimes cost Mexico between 8 and 15% of economic output every year due to the costs of insurance and medical care of victims, lost productivity account, and material damages. Particularly, the direct costs of violence and material losses is $16.6 billion, which makes up 1.3% of the country's GDP. The remainder is attributed to the company expenses like security and healthcare. At the same time, insecurity is affecting foreign investment and tourism to the country, and it is increasing companies' expenses since they have to pay for protection and safety. Insurance companies spend $930 million yearly in life insurance and protection. Now, let's take a look into Venezuela. In 2015, Caracas was ranked as the most dangerous city in the world. Research proves how the country has lost around 5% of its GDP over the years because of murders and other crimes. crime directly influences companies in their decisions on whether to do business inside the country or stay away. For example, there are a lot of owners of Venezuelan companies who live abroad and whose companies as a result produce less. Some researchers state that in order to reduce crime, Venezuela would need to invest $170 billion. Finally, let's analyze the case of Honduras. According to the World Bank, Honduras' record level of violent crime is costing the Central American country 10% of its gross domestic product every year. In addition, violence costs the Honduran private sector 4% of its potential profits annually as they need to pay for protection. The Chamber of Commerce and Industry of Tegucigalpa estimated that due to extortion, at least 7 out of every 10 small businesses in Honduras has closed, and that there has been a loss of about 130,000 jobs. As we have seen, Latin America's countries whose crime rate is high has showed a decrease of their GDP over the years. Now let's go back to the initial world map. Can you remember what was the crime rate in Europe? Europe has a 5% of share of global crime. And why is that? Well, European countries might have a more prosperous image because they're worldwide seen as more secure and stable. Therefore, people are willing to visit and consume, governments provide enough incentives for entrepreneurs, and moreover, investors trust European countries' economies, leading to a higher foreign direct investment. Knowing this, what could Latin American countries do in order to achieve a more secure and strong image? Well, we believe that government should invest in education in order to cultivate a better skilled labor force, incentivize talent, and promote innovation and technological advances. In addition, we would also recommend to increase in security and defense spending. By doing this, although in the short run there would be a decrease in its GDP, in the long run crime rate could be reduced, and as a result there would be an increase of gross domestic product. So what do you think? Do you believe this would help?